The Pacific Ocean, vast, endless, deceptively peaceful. The waves lapped gently against the hull of an aging Imperial Japanese destroyer, its engines humming as it cut through the waters of the Bismarck archipelago. It was March 18th, 1943, and aboard the Akikaze, over 60 men, women, and even children huddled together, unaware that this ship, this warship, wasn't taking them to safety, but to their deaths. This wasn't just another forgotten atrocity of World War II. This was something far more chilling. A massacre planned with cold precision, carried out not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet of open water, where no one could hear the screams. By early 1943, the Pacific War was reaching a critical turning point. The Japanese Empire, once an unstoppable force sweeping across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, was now feeling the weight of American and Allied counteroffensives. Battles raged across the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the surrounding waters. The tide had begun to turn, and with it, paranoia crept into the highest ranks of the Imperial Japanese military. With each passing month, Japan's forces became more ruthless. Every foreigner in occupied territory was seen as a potential spy and a liability. The war was no longer just about land and resources, it was about survival, and in the eyes of the Imperial Japanese military, survival justified anything, even the cold-blooded murder of civilians. The Akikaze was built for war. Designed to escort convoys and hunt enemy submarines, it was an unremarkable vessel in the grand theatre of World War II naval warfare. But on this day, it wouldn't be fighting an enemy fleet. Instead, it would become a floating execution chamber. On board were Catholic and Protestant missionaries, German clergy, nuns, their servants, and even 3 infants. Among them was Bishop Joseph Laux, the apostolic vicar of central New Guinea. Many of these people had lived in the region for years, dedicating their lives to their faith and to the local communities they served. They had been told they were being transported to safety. Instead, their fate had already been sealed. Orders had come from above. No witnesses, no survivors. The story of the Akikaze massacre isn't one that's widely told. It's not mentioned in most history books, and it doesn't have the same name recognition as events like Nanjing, Bataan, or Unit 731. But it should, because this was more than a war crime. It was a glimpse into the darkest depths of human cruelty, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency by men who believed they were just following orders and the emperor. This is the story of how a Japanese destroyer became a death ship. This is the story of the Akikaze massacre. The Akikaze sailed into war not as a celebrated warrior, but as a workhorse of the empire. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war machine moved with terrifying speed, sweeping through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Akikaze was there, not in the vanguard of Japan's conquests, but trailing behind, ensuring that the newly claimed territories remained secure. Originally commissioned in 1921, the Akikaze was a Minakaze-class destroyer built during the post-World War I era when Japan sought to modernize its navy. Designed for high-speed battleship escort, the Minakaze-class ships were among the fastest destroyers of their time, capable of reaching speeds of 39 knots. The Akikaze was armored with 4 120mm or 4.7-inch Type 3 naval guns mounted in single turrets along its deck. It carried 6 21-inch torpedo tubes arranged in 2 triple mounts, making it a potential threat to enemy warships, though its aging torpedoes and declining speed limited its effectiveness in combat. With a standard displacement of 1,345 tons and an overall length of 102.5 meters, the Akikaze had a crew complement of around 150 officers and enlisted men. By the time World War II was in full swing, these sailors found themselves facing a different kind of battle, not against enemy fleets, but against the relentless and unseen dangers of submarine warfare and aerial attack. The Akikaze was not built to dominate the seas, it was built to keep Japan's empire afloat, and for a time, it did just that. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Akikaze served as a first-line destroyer, participating in various fleet exercises and patrols as Japan expanded its naval capabilities. With the onset of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the Akikaze was deployed to support Japanese operations along the Chinese coast, providing escort for troop transports and participating in blockades. As newer and more advanced destroyers entered service, the Akikaze and her sister ships were gradually reassigned to secondary roles, including patrol duties leading up to and during the early stages of World War II. The Akikaze escorted ships bound for the Philippines, shielding them as Japanese forces stormed Manila in early 1942. It patrolled the South China Sea, ensuring the steady flow of resources from newly conquered lands. In the vast expanse of the Dutch East Indies, it was part of the naval forces that secured vital oil shipments from Borneo and Sumatra, fueling the empire's war machine. But the war was changing. By mid-1942, the momentum that had once propelled Japan forward began to stall. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had been a strategic setback. Then came the disaster at Midway in June, a crushing defeat that shattered Japan's carrier fleet and stripped away its aura of invincibility. The empire was no longer expanding, it was bracing for counterattacks. The Akikaze was drawn into the defensive struggle that followed. It became part of Japan's efforts to reinforce its positions in the Solomon Islands, where the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942. Later in 1943, the destroyer would participate in the frantic supply runs known as the Tokyo Express, delivering reinforcements, supplies, and weapons to the beleaguered Japanese troops fighting in the jungles of the Solomons. These missions were perilous. Enemy aircraft lurked in the skies, American submarines stalked beneath the waves, and the US Navy's growing presence made every voyage a gamble. By early 1943, Japan was losing ground. The long and grueling campaign for Guadalcanal had ended in defeat. The Japanese Navy, once dominant, now struggled to maintain its supply lines as the Americans pressed forward, island by island. The Akikaze continued its escort duties, ferrying supplies and troops between bases in the South Pacific, but the sense of urgency had changed. The empire was no longer on the offensive. It was trying to hold on to what it had taken. It was in this climate of desperation and paranoia that the Akikaze received its most infamous order. The war had turned against Japan, and every foreigner within its occupied territories was seen as a potential spy, a potential threat. It was no longer enough to control the Pacific. The empire now sought to purge it. The Pacific in 1943 was a theater of shifting tides. The war that had once been a relentless Japanese advance was now tilting in favor of the Allies. The Americans were no longer fighting for survival. They were pushing forward, tearing apart the empire Japan had fought so hard to build. The Imperial Japanese military knew that the longer the war dragged on, the worse their chances became. They needed time, resources, and a strategy to halt the enemy's advance. What they had instead was fear. Paranoia crept into every aspect of Japanese military operations. The Imperial Army and Navy had always viewed outsiders with suspicion, but as the war situation deteriorated, that suspicion turned to cold-blooded action. Every foreigner in occupied territories was seen as a potential spy, an informant for the advancing Americans. In the South Pacific, this paranoia was particularly severe. New Guinea and the surrounding islands had long been home to missionaries, traders, and expatriates from neutral nations. Many were of German descent, as Germany, which was Japan's wartime ally, had previously been a colonizing force in the Pacific, but even that was no guarantee of safety. In the eyes of Japan's military leadership, these civilians were a problem. They knew too much, they had lived among the local populations, and they might provide intelligence to the Allies if they were captured. The solution, as it often was in the Pacific War, was brutal in its simplicity: eliminate the problem. It wasn't enough to detain these individuals, they had to disappear. Orders were issued. Certain civilians in the region were to be removed. There would be no trials, no public executions. This was to be handled quietly. A warship was needed, one that could carry out the task far from prying eyes. The Akikaze, a destroyer that had spent most of its time escorting convoys, was chosen for the task. It had no particular notoriety, no history of large-scale atrocities, but it had space, it had guns, and most importantly, it had a crew that would follow orders without question. At its helm stood Lieutenant Commander Tsurukichi Sabe, a seasoned officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had spent years in service to the Empire. He was not a commander renowned for heroics or battlefield victories, but he was a dutiful soldier, a man who carried out orders without question. By May 1943, the Akikaze had already spent months patrolling the waters of New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, escorting ships, dodging Allied submarines, and keeping Japan's war machine running. The crew, hardened by routine, had settled into the rhythm of naval warfare. Long, uneventful stretches of open sea, punctuated by sudden moments of danger. Morale was neither high nor low. It was simply the reality of war, a quiet acceptance of duty, of fatigue, of the relentless cycle of orders given and orders obeyed. On March 18th, 1943, the Akikaze arrived at Wewak in modern-day Papua New Guinea. The prisoners, Catholic priests, German missionaries, nuns, and civilians, including 2 infants, were brought aboard. They were told they were being transported to an internment camp. There was no reason to doubt it. After all, Germany and Japan were allies, and these people hadn't been charged with any crimes. The prisoners aboard the Akikaze were not soldiers, spies, or resistance fighters. They were civilians, men, women, and children whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Most of them were missionaries, Catholic priests and nuns who had been living and working in Japanese-occupied New Guinea. Their presence in the region dated back decades, long before war came to the Pacific. The missionaries had first arrived in the late 19th century when Germany established a protectorate over northeastern New Guinea in 1884. As part of Germany's colonial expansion, Christian organizations such as the Rheinische Mission Society began evangelizing in the region. One of the most prominent figures was Johann Fliel, a Lutheran missionary who arrived in 1886 and went on to establish the Simbang mission station near Finschhafen and the Sattelberg station further inland. Over the years, these missionaries built churches, schools, and hospitals, providing education and medical care to the local population. The Society of the Divine Word, a German Roman Catholic missionary organization, also became deeply entrenched in the region, forming strong relationships with the indigenous communities they served. But in the eyes of the Imperial Japanese military, these men and women were no longer just religious figures. They were foreigners, outsiders who had lived in the Pacific for too long, forming connections with local people who could one day aid the advancing Allies. Germany and Japan were allies under the Axis Pact, but that alliance was built on military convenience, not ideological unity. The Nazis and the Imperial Japanese had little trust in one another, and that distrust extended to civilians. The Japanese military harbored deep suspicion toward any non-Japanese people living in their conquered territories, and Germans were no exception. It didn't matter that they were supposed to be allies. To the Japanese authorities, these missionaries had lived in the Pacific long enough to become a liability. The group taken aboard Akikaze had been rounded up from Rabaul, Kavieng, and other settlements in New Guinea. Some had already spent months under Japanese surveillance, detained in temporary internment camps with little explanation as to why. Among them were members of the Society of the Divine Word, whose mission in the Pacific dated back to the 1800s. These men and women had devoted their lives to spreading Christianity, but now they'd found themselves at the mercy of an empire that saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. For the missionaries and priests, captivity had been unsettling, but few believed they were in mortal danger. The Japanese had interned Germans before. Despite the growing tensions of war, Germany and Japan were still allies under the Tripartite Pact, and many of the detained missionaries assumed that their nationality offered them a degree of protection. They had seen other German expatriates and missionaries placed in internment camps, held under strict conditions, but never executed. The Japanese often relocated foreigners to camps where they would remain for the duration of the war, and while there had been rumors of mistreatment, mass executions of civilians were not standard policy, at least not yet. The prisoners were told that they were being relocated to another camp. Perhaps they believed it. Perhaps they clung to the idea that their status as religious figures, as non-combatants, as citizens of an allied nation, would spare them from harm. As they stepped aboard the Akikaze, there was no panic, no cries for mercy, only quiet resignation and the hope that the war would end before they were forgotten. At first, though, there was no indication of what was to come. The prisoners weren't mistreated. The crew didn't jeer at them, strike them, or make threats. If anything, they were almost hospitable. The nuns and priests were given space to sit, the children remained close by, and there were no immediate signs of hostility. Some crew members were even ordered to vacate their bunks so their guests could get comfortable. Food and water were provided. The ship's doctor attended to those suffering from seasickness. You might be used to hearing about the brutality of the Imperial Japanese military, the infamous cruelty shown to prisoners across the Pacific. But aboard the Akikaze, at least in these first hours, there was none of that. If anything, the treatment of the prisoners was oddly courteous, a deceptive calm before the storm. The Akikaze sailed smoothly over the waves. Its passengers, both prisoners and crew, had no idea that they were heading towards something darker than any battlefield. Hope lingered in the minds of the civilians. They'd endured months of uncertainty, but surely this was just another transfer. Japan and Germany were allies. Wouldn't that count for something? Wouldn't that protect them? But the crew was about to learn the truth. Somewhere along this journey, new orders would be revealed, and when they came, everything would change. This wasn't a relocation. There was no camp waiting for them. Only the sea, only silence, only death. As the ship pulled away from the coastline and into open waters, the civilians had no idea that they were sailing toward their deaths. The Akikaze, a ship once built for war, had now become something else entirely. A floating execution chamber, a tool of silent, methodical slaughter. The massacre was about to begin. The Akikaze sliced through the calm waters of the Bismarck archipelago, the steady hum of its engines a familiar rhythm beneath the feet of the crew. The sun hung high, its reflection shimmering off the deep blue sea, while a faint outline of distant islands faded into the horizon. Below deck, in the captain's quarters, something far more sinister was unfolding. The order came down the chain of command like a death sentence. It wasn't a decision made by the Akikaze's captain alone. It had come from higher up, the 8th Fleet headquarters. The reasoning was chillingly simple. The prisoners could not be allowed to fall into Allied hands. Japan's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. With the war turning against them, the fear of espionage and local uprisings grew. The German missionaries were deemed a liability. If captured by the Americans, they could provide intelligence, even if they had none to give. The order arrived in a sealed document. There was no justification, no detailed reasoning, just instructions. Execute all prisoners. No survivors. Dispose of the bodies at sea. Lieutenant Commander Tsurukichi Sabe read the order in silence. He had carried out many missions in service of the Empire, but this was different. This wasn't combat. This wasn't war. This was something else entirely. The weight of the order settled over the officers like a suffocating fog. The crew had grown accustomed to war, but this was something few of them had ever done before. These were not enemy combatants. They were civilians, women, priests, children, and for the past day, they had been treated well. Lieutenant Commander Sabe did not hesitate for long, however. Orders were orders. The prisoners had been classified as threats to national security, and Japan's policy was clear. Better to kill potential spies than risk intelligence falling into enemy hands. It didn't matter that they were missionaries. It didn't matter that they were Germans. And it certainly didn't matter that they were children. The only thing that mattered was following orders. There was no protest, no argument. Perhaps there was a moment of hesitation, but duty won out. The meeting ended quickly. The crew had their instructions. The execution would begin at dusk. The preparations began immediately. The deck, once a space of routine naval work where sailors tended to their duties and gazed out at the endless Pacific, was now being transformed into something far more sinister. Every movement, every action carried a quiet urgency, a mechanical precision that had not been there before. The air grew heavy with an unspoken tension, thick like the humidity that clung to the skin. The crew worked quickly, their faces unreadable, their hands steady despite the grim task before them. At the stern of the ship, a scaffold was erected. The structure was crude but functional, assembled from wooden planks repurposed from storage. It was built just high enough to ensure that when the time came, there would be no struggle, no chance of resistance. But the crew couldn't risk the prisoners realizing what was happening too soon. If panic set in, the executions could turn chaotic. And so, a white cloth was draped across the area like a curtain, shielding the work from prying eyes. To anyone looking, it seemed like nothing more than a standard windbreak or a temporary covering for equipment. Behind it, however, something monstrous was taking shape. Across the deck, straw mats were carefully laid down, not for comfort, not to provide the prisoners a place to rest, but to serve a darker purpose. They would soak up the blood, absorbing it before it could stain the planks, before it could seep into the wood and leave behind traces of what was about to happen. The mats were temporary, disposable. By the end of the night, they would be tossed overboard along with the bodies, leaving nothing behind but the whisper of waves against the hull. Buckets of seawater were prepared, lined up along the railing. They would be used to wash away the evidence, to cleanse the deck of the stains that would soon be left behind. The sea, vast and indifferent, would swallow it all. The ship would move on, as if nothing had happened. The Pacific would erase the crime as it had done countless times before. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the ship's engines slowed. The Akikaze drifted into a desolate stretch of open ocean. There were no islands in sight, no witnesses, only the vast expanse of the Pacific. It was time. The first group was called forward, several priests and missionaries. There were no shouts, no screams. The crew maintained the illusion that this was a routine procedure, leading the men toward the wooden planks near the edge of the ship. Perhaps the prisoners thought they were being transferred to another vessel. Perhaps they still clung to the hope that this was merely another stage of their internment. They were asked a series of questions, ostensibly to cover up the grim reality they were facing. Each was asked their name, nationality, age, and marital status, each answer dutifully recorded on a notepad which was subsequently and conveniently lost. Then came the blindfolds. It was at that moment, as a rough cloth was tied around their eyes, that some must have realized what was happening, but by then it was too late. As the ship sped up to cover the ensuing noise, each prisoner was tied hand and foot, and one by one hoisted up onto the scaffolding. A burst of gunfire rang out. The first man collapsed instantly, his body rolling off the planks and into the sea below. The water churned for a moment, darkening with blood, then went still. The wind carried away the scent of the gunpowder as the body drifted beneath the waves. More prisoners were led forward. The process was methodical, almost clinical. Small groups were brought up at one time, blindfolded, shot, and thrown into the ocean. The crew worked in silence, their faces unreadable as they carried out their orders. Then came the most horrifying moment of all: the children. Some accounts suggest that they were simply thrown overboard alive. The massacre lasted for nearly 3 hours. One by one, every prisoner was executed. The Akikaze, once a warship, had become something far darker, a machine of silent slaughter. The deck was washed down, scrubbing away the blood and any lingering traces of what had happened. The sheets of cloth used during the executions were discarded. The wooden planks, once standing as crude execution platforms, were tossed overboard. The rifles were cleaned and returned to storage. By the time the sun had fully set, it was as if nothing had happened. The ship's engines resumed their normal pace, and the Akikaze resumed its course. The crew returned to their duties, but the air was heavy with unspoken words. Some of the younger sailors avoided each other's eyes. Others sat in silence, staring at the dark waters below. By 10 p.m. that evening, the ship pulled into port with no indication of the dark events earlier in the day. No official report was filed. No record was kept. The Akikaze would continue its service as if this day had never occurred. But the men on board would not forget. The Pacific swallowed the evidence, but it could not erase the horror. The Akikaze massacre became one of many war crimes that were documented but never fully prosecuted. The details remained buried in military archives for years, referenced primarily in war crimes reports and intelligence files rather than in public trials. For decades, the Akikaze massacre remained buried beneath the weight of history, overshadowed by the more infamous war crimes of Imperial Japan. The rape of Nanjing, where entire cities were brutalized and left in ruins, the Bataan Death March, where thousands of Allied prisoners perished in forced marches under the blazing sun, and the horrific human experiments conducted by Unit 731. All these atrocities had undeniable proof. Mass graves, skeletal remains, liberated prisoners, and survivor testimonies painted a damning picture of Japan's wartime conduct. But the Akikaze massacre left behind no such evidence. There were no graves, no liberated survivors to testify, no forensic remains to be uncovered decades later. The victims, priests and nuns who had dedicated their lives to their faith were simply thrown into the sea, their bodies claimed by the vast and indifferent Pacific. There were no civilians left to tell their story, only the men who had carried out the crime. And for a long time, they kept silent. After the war, as Allied forces investigated Japanese war crimes, the Akikaze massacre did not immediately come to light. Unlike the atrocities committed on land, where evidence could be gathered from POW camps and local populations, crimes at sea were harder to trace. Many of the key figures responsible had already perished by the war's end, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, once a formidable force, had been reduced to wreckage scattered across the Pacific. The Akikaze itself had been sunk in November 1944, taking most of its crew to a watery grave. What happened on that ship could have vanished into history forever. Despite the Imperial Japanese Navy's attempts to cover up the massacre, the disappearance of Western missionaries and civilians in the Pacific did not go unnoticed, at least not forever. These were not nameless victims lost to the chaos of war. They were foreign nationals, well-documented members of religious organizations, and expatriate communities. Their sudden vanishing left behind questions, suspicions, and a silence that demanded answers. During the war, few outside of the Akikaze's crew knew what had happened. The ship had carried out its orders in open waters, far from prying eyes, and the Pacific had swallowed both the victims and the evidence. But silence does not last forever. In the years following Japan's surrender in 1945, the truth began to surface. Local reports from New Guinea and the surrounding islands spoke of Westerners being rounded up by Japanese forces, forced onto a ship, and never seen again. These were missionaries who had lived among the local population for decades, people who were known, who had ties to communities that had once relied on them. And now, they were gone. The Australian War Crimes Section, tasked with investigating Japanese atrocities in the Pacific, took particular interest in these disappearances. New Guinea had been an important battleground for Australian forces, and as survivors came forward to testify about what had happened under Japanese occupation, the names of missing priests, nuns, and civilians began to emerge. Through interrogations of Japanese naval officers and personnel who had left the Akikaze before its fateful sinking, investigators began to piece together the horrifying details. The massacre hadn't been an act of rogue brutality, nor had it been a chaotic wartime incident. It had been planned, systematic, and approved by higher command. The 8th Fleet headquarters had issued the execution orders, and the crew had followed them with cold precision. Further investigations pointed to high-ranking Japanese officials within the 8th Fleet, including Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa and Chief of Staff Vice Admiral Shinzo Onishi. Both were interrogated about their role in the massacre, but they denied direct responsibility, instead placing blame on Lieutenant Shigetoku Kami. Some historians, such as Yuki Tanaka, argue that this was a convenient deflection, as the Imperial Japanese Navy's rigid chain of command meant such an order would not have been carried out without higher authorization. Despite the overwhelming evidence of premeditated mass murder, no one was ever prosecuted for the Akikaze massacre. The lack of surviving witnesses, the absence of physical evidence, and the sheer number of war crimes being investigated in the Pacific made prosecution difficult. By the time the full details of the massacre were uncovered, the major war crimes trials, including the Tokyo trials, were winding down. Though some Japanese officers were charged with war crimes in the Pacific, the men responsible for the deaths aboard the Akikaze escaped justice. The ocean had erased the evidence, and post-war priorities had buried the crime. The men who had given the orders, whether it was Kami, Onishi, or even Mikawa, faced no consequence for the massacre. Those who had carried out the execution were either dead, had vanished into obscurity, or were protected by the shifting priorities of post-war politics. For decades, the massacre remained a footnote in history, buried in military records and war crimes reports, referenced only in intelligence files rather than public trials. But history has a way of resurfacing. It wasn't until much later, with historians like Mark Felton and Toshiyuki Tanaka, that the Akikaze massacre gained renewed attention. Felton's 2007 book, Slaughter at Sea, The Story of Japan's Naval War Crimes, examined the Akikaze alongside other atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Navy. One of the first major works to bring the massacre into the broader historical narrative. His research, alongside declassified war crime records, interrogation transcripts, and post-war intelligence files, helped reconstruct what had happened on that fateful day in 1943. The massacre also gained more attention as researchers began re-examining the role of the Imperial Japanese Navy in wartime atrocities. For decades, the Army's crimes, the horrors in China, the brutality against POWs in Southeast Asia, dominated the historical record. But the Navy too had blood on its hands. The massacre aboard Akikaze was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern, a doctrine of total war in which civilians were disposable if they posed even a theoretical risk to Japan's war effort. The Akikaze massacre remains a grim reminder of the horrors of unchecked militarism and blind obedience to orders. Unlike other war crimes that left behind physical scars, concentration camps, bombed out villages, mass graves, the Akikaze left behind nothing. No traces of its victims remained, no justice was ever served, only the memories of those who had once walked its deck. A massacre swallowed by the ocean, but never truly forgotten. The Akikaze was never meant to be infamous. It was not a legendary battleship, nor a symbol of Japan's naval might. It was, for most of its existence, an unremarkable destroyer, just another vessel among hundreds in the Imperial Navy's fleet. And yet, by the time the war ended, it had become something far darker. For the sailors who carried out the massacre, what did they feel as they scrubbed the deck clean that day? Did they tell themselves that they had no choice? Did they think about the priests and nuns, the children they had thrown into the sea? Did the younger crew members, those who had spoken to the prisoners, who had seen their humanity, carry the weight of that moment for the rest of their lives? We'll never know. Most of these men vanished into history, their names forgotten, their fates unknown. The ocean took the Akikaze, just as it had taken its victims. But history does not forget, and neither should we. So that's our look into the Akikaze massacre, a war crime carried out in silence, far from the battlefield and hidden by the endless Pacific. An atrocity that, for decades, remained in the shadows, unprosecuted, nearly lost to history. It's a reminder of how war doesn't just kill soldiers, it consumes the innocent, the helpless, those who never held a weapon yet still found themselves in its path. As always guys, thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something new.